7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Right Fit Podcast. I'm Darryl Jacobs, your host. Join me every Friday at noon Eastern Time with guests who are decision-making both in collegiate athletics and professional sports. But joining me this afternoon is Director of Athletics at North Carolina Central University, Dr. Ingrid Wicker McCree. Dr. McCree, welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thank you.
Good. Before we get started with the Q&A, let's talk briefly about your journey into collegiate athletics and why.
Well, at George Washington undergrad, I was a criminal justice major, actually. And I worked in the D.C. jail as an intern. And then when I graduated, I worked on Capitol Hill for a couple of congressmen as a congressional intern. And so my pathway was really, I wanted to be an attorney, a lawyer. Judy Martino, who was the head volleyball coach at North Carolina State, called me up and said, "Hey, Ingrid, I remember you from club. And there's not enough Black females in coaching on the collegiate level. And she offered me a grad assistant position at North Carolina State University. And so that was really, after graduation, initially my entry into coaching. I had a great time. Coach V, Jimmy V was still there, Derek Wittenberg, Stan, all of them. And so it was a great experience. Prior to that, however, when I was in undergrad, once I ran out of the money that my parents were giving me for the semester, I had to get a job. And I actually worked part-time in the Smith Center at GW with facility operations. And so I worked in the equipment room. I worked at the front desk when patrons would come in. I actually worked gymnastics meets and the basketball games. And so for me at that time, I was just trying to get extra dollars. But as Monique Tony Smith would say, the seeds were being planted very early on for a career in athletic administration. And so when I got to North Carolina State, I was, like I said, a grad assistant for volleyball. But then I ran into Dr. Leroy T. Walker at a banquet somewhere. And he said, "Well, Ingrid, there's not enough Black women in athletic administration." And at the time I was majoring in sociology in terms of grad school. And I said, "Well, who am I to argue with Dr. Leroy T. Walker?" And so I went and changed my major to Recreation Administration Resources over in North Carolina State. And so I started that pathway from the actual learning in the classroom, the pedagogy aspects of athletic administration at NC State. After I finished there, I was afforded the opportunity to become a volunteer assistant coach at North Carolina A&T. At the time, I was still working in Raleigh in the jail for pretrial. So I was still hovering back and forth between the two, professions. But then the next year, they made it a full-time coach at North Carolina A&T, and Dr. Willie Burden hired me as the first full-time head coach at North Carolina A&T. So I did that for 2 years. But at the same time, I kind of shared with him that I was interested in administration. Early woman in administration that I saw that worked with me there was Marlon Jones. And so just really seeing some other females along the way really got me more interested. And so a year later, Sandra Schuler, the first volleyball coach here at North Carolina Central, we played them. We beat them, actually. North Carolina A&T beat Central for the first time in a very long time, although Central was Division II and A&T was Division I. And she let me know that she was retiring and that the position would be open. And so, again, here's someone reaching out to me. And that's why I always tell people you never know who can help. And so I applied for the position and then became the head volleyball, softball, an adjunct instructor in our kinesiology and rec program. And just along the way, with each athletic director I worked for, they gave me more administrative responsibilities. So I was very, very fortunate early on to coach and be an administrator. And so my empathy skills for both sides of the house it grew, because of those roles. And basically, after Coach Hayes decided to leave to go to FAMU, at that time I was not coaching anymore. I had retired from coaching and was overseeing our business operations and was in the right place at the right time. I was interim, and I kind of thought about, well, can I really do this, or do I want to do this? Because the tenure of our ADs before me was not very long. And so, but Dr. Charlie Nams, who was the chancellor at the time, knew this transition was going to be challenging and wanted someone who can understand from a coach's perspective, and manage the transition from that perspective, as well as a former student athlete. And he gave me that opportunity to sit in the chair. And for 13 and a half years later, I'm still here, and I've had a wonderful opportunity, wonderful experiences, leading this program during that time.
Well, you spent quite a bit of time over there at Central, as you mentioned, 13 as the athletic director, over 28, somewhere there's about, if I'm correct,
Yeah.
just being on that campus totally. But what a lot of the viewers and listeners may not know, North Carolina Central University is a historical Black university. Talk about what athletics is like there at North Carolina Central University.
Well, I mean, the history of our athletics program, going back to 1910 when baseball was our first program, John McClendon, it's just an amazing opportunity to lead the rich history. I mean, Dr. Walker, I mean, it could go on and on, Sam Jones, Ernie Barnes, so that in itself, inheriting that to be a part of and to lead has always been amazing. But I think it's like a piece of unfinished artwork, or an ongoing piece of artwork. I wouldn't say unfinished, because we know there's a lot of artists that did not finish their artwork for all kinds of crazy reasons. But I would just say it's still being crafted. This transition is still going on. We just completed a new strategic plan in 2020 to 2025. But even with a new AD coming in, they may decide they want their own strategic plan. So it's just always an ongoing piece of work. And although I think we have had some early success in our revenue sports, particularly football and basketball, but it's still so much more to do, and creating new revenue sources, making sure that we're really in tune with student athlete well-being, especially as the climate changes in the NCAA with the student athlete voice, focusing on facilities. When we transitioned, we wanted to focus really on the internal side and building the structure in terms of the staff. We went from 25 full-time people to now it's almost 80 full-time people. And so we focused on those aspects, the academics, eligibility, compliance, the infrastructure. Now there needs to be a focus on facilities, and so that we can be even more competitive, a focus on equity and making sure that all of our sports have all the things that they need. And so to me, again, it's just an artwork in progress, but there's been so many successes along the way that we can applaud our student athletes, applaud the coaches, but it's a work in progress.
Most of the time when you talk to administrators such as yourself, I always ask the question, and for a lot of the coaches that watch this show, as well as administrators that have tuned in, culture.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the culture there at North Carolina Central University, particularly within the athletic department.
Well, I think there's a culture of honesty from my very first day. Understanding, again, from a coach's point of view and administrator, it is transparency and honesty is so integral to success and relationships. There's a culture of respect, accountability, developing people. I strongly believe in professional development. Even during COVID, that's one thing that we didn't cut from our budget, was the opportunity for people to get better. Because this is higher ed. It's not just for our students to be developed, but it is anyone that enters this campus in this whole realm of higher ed. It's developing people. And I think most importantly, it's a family culture. Every recruit or prospective student athlete that coaches bring here to my office and with their parents, I tell them it's not just their coaching staff that's responsible for them. It's 83 people that are responsible for their son or daughter when they touch foot on this campus. And so I would think that is probably the most, you know, the biggest piece of our culture is the family environment that we've established here.
One of the things what I try to do on the show is talk about the hiring process, the type of questions, the do's and don'ts. From your personal experience as a candidate coming into collegiate athletics as well as an AD, talk about those experiences and how have they helped you to get to where you're at now.
So I've been very blessed that I haven't had to do so many of, for me in terms of getting into a job. And I have had to interview for different committee appointments and things like that. But I can remember back, interviewing for the volleyball and softball teaching job, and I was very confident because I had worked for some great coaches, had been mentored by some great people, and, spent just so much time in the volleyball world. There's always that feeling of, anxiousness, with any interview, even this interview, right? There's a little anxiety, although you're a phenomenal host and make people feel very comfortable, but it's still, you're on the spotlight, you're in the spotlight. And so you're always worried about saying the wrong thing, and not answering the questions. But at the end of the day, honestly, I think if you're resourceful and do your research on the organization, the people who you're going to be meeting with, it gives you a level of comfort, a better level of comfort going into that interview setting. I think when I interviewed for the AD job, because I had been here for a long time and grew with people that now I'm going to be leading, I knew they were going to ask me, well, how are you going to handle if you have to discontinue or terminate someone that you've grown with as a person in your career? And so I already anticipated that, was able to answer it clearly, that it comes down to expectations. And as long as you're clear with those individuals on what we're trying to accomplish, you hold them to those expectations. And so I just think that for me, it's just being prepared, doing my homework, reading the room, any of those type of skills that you can gain from doing it. And doing mock interviews are phenomenal. They're wonderful, but it's still not that same anxiety that you're going to have that day, but it still helps you to prepare. And, because then people are going to be asking whoever you're doing that mock interview with questions that you may not think that are the typical questions, So I think from my experiences, and now I'm having to do that again, right? Because I'm transitioning
Right.
and, doing various things, and interviewing at Maryville was very different. So it's the more research you can do and the more you know about what that organization needs at that time, knowing this transition was occurring at the very beginning of my tenure, I had to speak to that. Why was I a good fit for a program that was getting ready to go down this big old black hole? And what was my plan to really help them get out of that? So, but I had to know what was the status or the climate at that time of that organization or of NCCU athletics before preparing, to prepare for that interview.
Well, Dr. Wicker McCree, I got to pay some bills. So let's go to a commercial break and we'll come back here on The Right Fit.
The Right Fit podcast is brought to you by Rising Coaches Search and Consulting. Tired of spending what seems like all of your time and budget filling coaching vacancies? Let Rising Coaches Search and Consulting handle your next coaching search. Our process is simple. We identify, vet, and recruit a talented and diverse group of professionals that fits your institution's profile, all for a low price that we guarantee will beat our competitions. Plus, all of your searches will be handled by former coaches, meaning we will get the best possible insight on all of your candidates, and you'll get the perspective that only a former coach could provide. For testimonials, a full client list, or more information, please visit risingcoaches.com.
Welcome back to the Right Fit Podcast. I'm your host, Darryl Jacobs, and my guest today is the Director of Athletics at North Carolina Central University, Dr. Ingrid Wicker McCree. And we're talking about the right fit. And we'll get into that more so now in the second part of the interview. Dr. McCree, based on cultural resources, location, and facility at North Carolina Central University, describe the type of individual that would be the ideal fit within your athletic department.
Well, topping it off is, of course, great people skills, because of this. In this position, you are interfacing with all kinds of constituents from every background that you can imagine. And so the ability to communicate clearly and appropriately with all constituents. I call it killing with kindness, which is hard work. In managing grown folk relationships to include parents and to include your colleagues and peers across campus. So great people skills, being an empathetic leader and understanding people from their perspective before making decisions, being resourceful and understanding where you are, what you have, and how will you make that stretch. I know people don't like when I say we make broke look good, but it's the truth. And so being able to do that, being in tune with any and everything, all NCAA and college sports, because it is changing ever so quickly. I think being on the D1 Council allows me the opportunity to see things before they happen, and you just have to be in tune with all of that. Being in tune with this amazing generation of student athletes. You know, they're not, we all were different, right? During our different generations. And we have to be, this person has to be very flexible and understand that, you know, coaches and AD, we don't have the power of the pen anymore, you know? So how do you reach these student athletes and how do you reach these parents? They have to have a good business acumen. And again, how to stretch the resources that they have, but also how to create more resources and working with your campus partners to do that. You know, we talked about earlier fundraising skills. You know, how do you know how to make those connections that you need to make, especially in our community here in Durham? It's a very diverse community and inclusive community. You know, being from Durham, just seeing amazing growth of this area. But you have to be able to fit in and get into those pockets of people to make those right connections. And then the biggest, I think, characteristic of an ideal fit, patience. I'll end with that, patience.
Patience. And me having been a former administrator and coach at a couple of HBCUs as well as PWIs, that's something, and that's something you got to have, particularly if you're at those low resource schools and you don't have it, and you have to be patient, or you got to learn how to make things happen within the confines. You mentioned campus partners, and a lot of times when coaches, particularly coaches that watch the show, when they go for interviews, one of the things I say, you got to have to understand how to get along with internal and external constituents. And sometimes they don't understand that, but it's not even about X and O's. Sometimes being the right fit doesn't constitute what kind of record you have on the court.
That's right.
It's more so what you can do in terms of your interview and how do you feel about you when you go for the interview. Are you the right fit, you know, for them as well? So thank you for sharing that. 3 do's and don'ts of interviewing.
Let's see. Do your research. We talked about that earlier. Just what is the current climate, culture? Is it a winning program? Is it a transitioning program? No, even before you even think about applying for the job, you know, what is that? Some people, some coaches, some administrators, young administrators they want to be in the seat, or they just want to be the head coach. And not every situation is appropriate at the appropriate time, right? And so really understand and find out as much as you can about that school, that program before even applying. Do your research on who you'll be interviewing with. You know, think about, you know, who do they work for? You know, what is their coaching tree or their administrator tree? What was their pathway to leadership? So try to find as much as you can and just write those little notes down, because now that gives you a leeway or a pathway into having other conversations during your interview, right? Which now makes you feel more at ease. Now you may have stories that they can, relate to in giving your answers during that interview. Third, I would say get plenty of rest before the interview. I know that is hard because of the anxiety, but I would say plenty of rest so that you're poised and you're ready and you're fresh. And a bonus, so 3.5 do's, right, would be don't be afraid to ask for clarity of the questions. So if you don't understand, ask. Can you, share that in a different way? Can you ask, what do you mean? So oftentimes I think we maybe ask questions and we try to answer and we may be totally off track with what they're asking. The 3 don'ts, be authentic. And I was just talking to Jen Fry about how she has become authentically filtered over her progression into the person that she is now. And so it is always great to be yourself, and don't forget about being tactful. You're still in a professional setting, and don't get too relaxed. Don't try to answer a question that you don't know, because then they'll write that down. They did not answer the question. If you don't know the answer, just politely say, hey, I'm not familiar with that, and then my biggest pet peeve is don't name drop. Just save that for later. Save it for when you get the job. Now you bring those relationships to the table. But so many times, people name drop and then they get there and then, okay, well, what happened to you? You said you had a relationship with this person. So that's a pet peeve of mine. Don't name drop.
Well, I hate the name drop, as well. Often people find out, certain people. They be like, why you never told me? I'm like, listen, I don't want you to know because I want you bugging me, probably.
Right.
Probably I didn't say that as well. But one of the things you mentioned about the dues, it's a commonality with somebody that's on the search committee, trying to find that connection, a commonality with them, whether you know somebody that worked with them at a previous institution, whether you know something about the area they're working in, you got to find that commonality, as you mentioned. And that makes you comfortable in the interview because you start seeing heads nod and like, yeah. And then
That's
you start
right.
to feel more confident as well. I learned that a long time ago. Learn how to work the room, and you work the room well, you do your homework, you're going to keep yourself in the interview process as well.
That's right.
After 13 years as the athletic director there at North Carolina Central University, you're retiring at the end of this academic year. What has brought you the most satisfaction?
Wow. There's so many things. I would say definitely graduation, that whole week of, seeing the families come back from when they dropped them off 4 years, most of the time. Some of them you see throughout the time.
Right.
But I think just seeing the parents and their family members and their faces of excitement, because it's an accomplishment not just for the student athlete, it is an accomplishment of that family, and all the people that supported their son or daughter, granddaughter, grandson, nephew, niece, whatever, over those 4 or 5 years. And so that is one. Definitely hearing from and seeing my former student athletes. And I'm in touch with a lot of them. And that is very gratifying to me. That says to me that I have impacted lives. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to get emotional. I have impacted lives in a positive way. And so I have 2 or 3 Facebook groups of different, and it's so funny because it depends on when you were here. You either got Ingrid Wicker McCree. So just really keeping in touch and seeing them when they come back from homecoming or when they come to games, when I'm traveling and seeing all the great things that they're doing. And then finishing up this year with the 984 APR. And if you only understood the struggles that we have had, the 2 data reviews and, some of the little violations, but to be where we are with APR and knowing how hard our academic team worked to get here, I feel very accomplished and very proud of that.
We're not even talking about the many championships you have won, not just when you were coaching there as well, but as an administrator there, you won a plethora of championships across all sports as well. And it's my hope that this is not the last director of athletic position you hold. You're too good to be not helping the young student athletes, in particular, not just student athletes, but students across the campuses as well. So it is my hope you will continue in that chair. And North Carolina Central University is certainly losing a good one, Dr. Wicker McCree.
Thank you.
Word association. Now, I love this part of my interview with my guests. Word association. I say one word, you say the first thing that come to mind.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
Durham, North Carolina.
Home.
Volleyball.
Foundation.
Family.
My rock. Rock. I'm sorry. One word.
Okay. And North Carolina Central University.
Achievement.
Dr. McCree, thank you for taking the time to join me this afternoon. I greatly appreciate you taking the time. I want to thank the viewers and the listeners for joining us as well. Join me next Friday with another great guest here on the Right Fit Podcast. Until then, I'm Darryl Jacobs. Please stay healthy, stay safe, and have a great weekend.